Thank you for joining me for Explore the Bible, Session 6, Mark's Gospel, chapter 7, verse 25 to verse 30. I began the lesson with my class by asking them, our world would be unrecognizable to the first century person. Can you give me some examples of how dramatic the change has been in our world from his world? Now, I asked them, set aside the technology. That's an obvious thing, but I'm talking more along the lines of the values that are placed upon women, how women are treated, women's rights. How's that different than the first century? The equality of the races, how that's different. Education opportunities, the economics between a first century person and today, or maybe prisons and how prisoners are treated, just a whole host of things. One of the things I was caught by surprise was about women is they actually said women were treated better in the first century than they are today. The truth of the matter is they're thinking of the 1950s, not 50 AD. They did understand that women were treated as property. They just hadn't made the connection that they were not only viewed as property, but they were treated as property. So there's so vast a difference between the first century AD and our day. The reason is because of Jesus. James Kennedy wrote a book many years ago entitled, What If Jesus Had Never Been Born? And he chronicles through his book all the different areas of life and how Jesus has so dramatically impacted those areas. Education, healthcare, the justice system, racial issues, civic rights, health, just on and on. Jesus has had this huge impact and improvement upon the world. And life was very different before Jesus. Well, why? Because of our lesson today. Jesus breaks down the walls to show compassion to all. That statement is an explanation for the huge, almost unimaginable difference in our day and the day of the first century. And God's people are to be exhibiting Jesus' compassion. Now let's talk about the context of this passage of Scripture. What precedes this is a discussion on dietary laws. Jesus had said to them when it came to those things that what a man eats is not what causes him to be unclean, because it goes into the stomach and it's eliminated. And the question would be then, if there's no difference between the foods, could that also mean there's no difference between people? And it's preparing for this worldwide mission that Jesus has so that the message of Christ goes not only to the Jews, but to the Gentiles. And Mark sets that up with the stories we're going to look at with the Syrophoenician woman and the man who is deaf and blind. Now, the Pharisees had carefully erected barriers that kept person, places, things, and times as pure or polluted or as fit or unfit. And these classifications helped guard against uncleanness. They assumed that if it's associated with death or disease or demons, that it would separate you in your fellowship from God. And so they erected these barriers. And if you happened to violate those barriers, they had these rituals and ceremonies that you participated in order to be religiously decontaminated and restored in your relationship with God. And that meant that until you were decontaminated, sinners were to be held at arm's length. But Jesus just seemed to be out of control from the Pharisees' perspective. He did not pay attention to their man-made rules that guarded against uncleanness. In chapter 1, he touches a man that's a leper. In chapter 2 of Mark, he eats with sinners. In chapter 5, he's touched by a woman with an issue of blood. In chapter 7, he touches a young girl that is dead. That's in chapter 5. And in chapter 7, we have this story of his conversation with this Gentile woman. It's almost as if Mark is saying, you don't need to safeguard the holiness of God. You need to understand that Jesus wasn't made unclean. Jesus made those situations clean, and he gave them life. He restored them to life. In other words, the transforming power of God doesn't need to be protected. It needs to be let loose on this world. And it will be transforming. It will break down the walls that men have erected. And why is that? Because of God's love for people. Now this lesson talks about 3 different groups of people: the humble, the outsiders, and the exuberant. The first is the humble, as we are introduced to this woman that's known as a Syrophoenician woman. Now notice in verse 25, instead, immediately after hearing about him, a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit came and fell at his feet. The woman was a Gentile, a Syrophoenician by birth, and she was asking Jesus to cast the demon out of her daughter. After the debate on the food laws, Jesus erases another boundary. And it's this division between Jews and Gentiles. And the audience is being challenged to not set boundaries against the universality of God's love and his message for them. And few could approach Jesus who were at a greater disadvantage than this woman. First of all, she's a Gentile. Secondly, she's a woman. And third, she comes because her daughter has a demon. It's an unclean demon is the way Mark refers to it. And maybe that's implying the outcome was the result of unclean rituals. So we don't know anything about her background other than it could have been extremely horrible and wicked. Now, it's twice emphasized her identification. She's a Gentile woman. She's a Syrophoenician at that. And Josephus said that these people, the Syrophoenicians, were the bitterest enemies of Israel. It is remarkable that this woman would come to this Jewish healer begging for help. In verse 27, he said to her, Jesus said to this woman, "Let the children be fed first, because it isn't right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." But she replied to him, "Lord, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Then he told her, "Because of this reply you may go. The demon has left your daughter." When she went back to her home, she found her child lying on the bed, and the demon was gone. What is going on here? This doesn't seem like the Jesus we know. There are times when Jesus appears rude and he appears to be insulting. This is one of those times. Nobody seems to care so much when he's rude and insulting to the Pharisees and he calls them whitewashed sepulchres. But this is a mother who's pleading for her daughter. What's going on here? There are times when Jesus sets boundaries or barriers in front of people to push them to be confronted by the truth. And what you'll see is one of 2 reactions when people come to that point. They'll either stiffen with pride and reject Christ, or they'll humble themselves and yield in submission to the authority of Christ. And what you see in the Pharisees is this stiffening, this offendedness and resistance to Christ. What you see in this woman is her humbling herself and yielding to the authority of Christ. Now, some have tried to lessen the offensiveness of this by saying that the word that Jesus uses here for dogs is talking about a household dog as opposed to a stray that was traveling in the community in packs, maybe even a reference to puppies. But that's not at all what Mark's intending us to do. He's intending us to sense the offensiveness. I mean, does it make you feel better if someone called you a piglet instead of a hog? I mean, they're both swine is what they're calling you. But what the woman does is she catches Jesus' emphasis and she adds to the metaphor by saying, but yes, Jesus, the dogs still get to eat. Now, I'm sure all of you have seen and had little children who, when they got through eating, scattered around their high chair was a terrible mess of food. That's the scene that's taking place here. Children are messy eaters. And that food that winds up on the floor, the dogs get to eat that. And she's taking that picture, adding to it, and saying, there's still enough of you. There's still enough of your grace. There's still enough of your love, your power, your healing for us Gentiles. And Jesus finds that to be wonderful. Now, because of this reply, he says, you can go home, your daughter's healed. He doesn't have to be present. He doesn't have to touch her. Who has the power to do that? Only God has the power to do it. It's another testimony to Mark that this is the Messiah. This is God in the flesh. She has the faith that Jesus is spoken the truth to her. And without Jesus being present, without Jesus touching her daughter, she turns and she leaves to go home, finding exactly what Jesus said to be true. This is a picture of the humble. Now, I asked the class, who do we look at in society like that society looked upon this Syrophoenician woman? Who is it that's unclean in our society? For example, there are prisoners, there's the illegal immigrant, there are people of other religions, there are foster kids, there are the homeless. Who are the people we call the unclean? And then the question is, after that, how does the church minister to the unclean? In each one of those examples, there's wonderful testimony of how the church is working to minister. But the real question comes down to this: what can we do to minister? Where has God called our Sunday school class to help break down barriers, to bring Jesus to people in these areas? One of the things you might consider is your class participating with Church in the Park. Or if someone has an interest in the jail ministry, they're always looking for someone. And the ministries that deal with girls who are pregnant outside of marriage, those kind of pregnancy centers. There's just a host of ways that we can minister to people that society wants to hold at arm's length. The second group is the outsider and the healing of this man. It says in verse 31, again, leaving the region of Tyre, he went the way of Sidon to the Sea of Galilee through the region of Decapolis. He's still in Gentile territory. Verse 32, they brought to him a deaf man who had a speaking difficulty and begged Jesus to lay his hands on him. The emphasis of this verse is the urgency in which these people, they're so urgent. They bring this man to Jesus and they begged Jesus. They begged Jesus to lay. This man is in a desperate condition. And the extra effort that Jesus shows, the extra activity, shows how great a miracle Jesus is doing. And just briefly, notice what he does. He puts his fingers in the man's ears. Remember, the man can't hear. The man can't speak. And Jesus touches him and he puts his fingers in his ears. And maybe that is to communicate to this man, something's going to happen to my ears. And Jesus spits, and he takes the spit and touches the man's tongue. And when you spit, generally you're wanting to get something out of your mouth. And Jesus is fixing to take this man's handicap and take it out of his mouth and maybe transfer his speech to this man's speech. And it's done without any effort on Jesus's part. The man instantly hears. Think about it. The first words he probably heard were Jesus saying, "Be opened." And then he begins to praise Jesus with that tongue. The way that I spoke to the class about this is, why would what's your class strategy to include new people in the group? New people are, in a sense, the outsider. What is your class's strategy to bring those people in and make them feel comfortable? Things like regularly scheduled fellowships, or someone assigned to follow up with them and contact them, or starting new classes, or just spending time with them outside of Sunday school class. Why would you do something so uncomfortable and disruptive as creating a new class? Because of your compassion for newcomers and additional people to be brought into the fellowship. So what's your class's strategy to include new people in the group? Last of all, verse 36 to 37, he ordered them to tell no one, but the more he ordered them, the more they proclaimed it. Jesus doesn't always tell people to not tell. These are what are called the messianic secrets. They generally are tied into a particular context in the passage where Jesus is wanting to do something, and they're going out and telling about his powerful display is going to interrupt that. And this whole thing started when you go further back into Mark. Jesus taking the disciples away, he's wanting to have a time of teaching. But he's so interrupted, he's so pressed upon that he's not able to spend this time. And so he's wanting to take time with these disciples. That's probably what's taking place when he tells them, don't tell. Well, they can't do it. Verse 37 is one of the most exuberant passages in the Bible. I mean, everything about it talks about the excessive joy these people have. Verse 37, they were extremely astonished. In the original language, those words are at the very front of the sentence for emphasis. They're in bold letters. They're highlighted. They're underlined to say how excited these people were. And they said, he's done everything well. That takes us back to Genesis 1, where when God acted after each day, it said it was good. And that's a reflection of who he is. And then the last passage, he even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. That's a correct translation. It puts the word deaf and the word mute before the action. The deaf, he makes them hear. The mute, he makes them speak. They are so excited about this. Now, what does this have to do? How can we apply this? Could it be that the isolation that people experience is because we have lost the excitement of what God has done for us? So I asked the class, when you think of your personal testimony, what's the exciting word to a divorcee? When you think of your personal testimony, what's the exciting word that you could share with someone who's involved in the LGBT community, or the poor, or the prisoner, or even the highly educated? What is it that you experienced about Jesus that they so desperately need? And then to close the lesson, I gave again another postcard that's postmarked already. And I reminded them, last week I gave you a postcard to write to someone to point that person to Jesus. This week, would you take this postcard and would you use it to express your love of Jesus to someone? They'll find it. In fact, they will, when they receive it, I wouldn't be surprised it'll go on the refrigerator, because Jesus' compassion has the way to break down barriers. This may be the beginning of breaking down the barrier for someone to attend on Easter Sunday. God bless you.